A very good morning to one and all. I'm Pallavi, Assistant Professor of Management and organizing member of the event. I feel privileged to welcome you all on behalf of Management Department, GFGC Vijayanagar, to the 6th day of International Faculty Development Program on New Paradigms in Management Education. It's my pleasure to welcome the gathering. Firstly, high energy, work ethic, and lightheartedness make him a natural leader and a motivator. The chief patron of the program and principal GFGC Vijayanagar, Dr. B. Chandrasekhara sir, I cordially welcome you to the program.
Thank you, Pallavi.
With great pleasure, I welcome Dr. Shubha, who is known for her hard work and dedication. She is an IQAC coordinator and patron of the program. I welcome you, madam. It warms my heart to welcome an inspiration, Manjula R. Madam, convener of the program and HOD, Department of Management. A very warm welcome to you, madam.
Good morning. Thank you.
It's a moment of extreme pleasure to welcome the guest speaker, Arvind Jayakumar Iyer, Delivery Manager and Principal Solutions, Affine Analytics Private Limited, with MBA from University of Oxford, UK. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation and joining with us for this program. I cordially welcome you to the program, sir.
Pleasure is mine, ma'am. Thank you so much for having me here.
I'm proud to welcome him. He leads, he inspires, and he delivers. I'm talking about our organizing secretary of the program and MBA coordinator, Mr. Kishore Kumar. I welcome you, sir. An effective team player, a delight to work with, Ms. Madhushri, Assistant Professor of Management and Coordinator of the program. I welcome you wholeheartedly, Madhu.
Thank you.
This program could have not been possible without all the teaching and non-teaching staff of the institution. A heartfelt welcome to one and all. You all stayed with us, supported us, and made this event larger than life. We highly appreciate you for giving us your valuable time. I wholeheartedly welcome you all to the program, my dear delegates. Let us hear a story, okay? A blind boy sat on the steps of a building with a hat by his feet. He held up a sign which said, "I am blind, please help." There were only few coins in that hat. A man was walking by. He took a few coins from his pocket and dropped them into the hat. He then took the sign, turned it around and wrote some words. He put the sign back to that everyone who walked by would see the new words. Soon that the hat began to fill up. A lot more people were giving money to the blind boy. That afternoon, the man who had changed the sign came to see how things were. The boy recognized his footsteps and asked, "Were you the one who changed my sign this morning? What did you write?" The man said, I only wrote the truth. I said what you said, but in a different way." What he had written was, "Today is a beautiful day and I cannot see it." Do you think the first sign and the second sign were saying the same thing? Of course, both signs told the people the boy was blind. But the first sign simply said that boy was blind. The second sign told the people they were so lucky that they were not blind. Should we be surprised that the second sign was more effective? This story teaches us to be creative, to be innovative, think different, and think positive. That is the crust of today's topic, case study-based teaching. Case studies have been used for years by business, law, and medical schools, physicians on rounds, and artists, critics at work. Like other forms of problem-based learning, case studies can be accessible for every age group, both in subject and interdisciplinary work. To prepare students for jobs that haven't been created yet, we need to teach them how to be great problem solver so that they will be ready for anything. One way to do this is by teaching content and skill using real-world case studies, a learning model that focuses on reflection during problem-solving process. Case study-based teaching has several defining characteristics, including versatility, storytelling power, and efficient self-guiding learning. To give more insight on this case study-based learning, we have with us Mr. Arvind Jaikumar Iyer. I'm profoundly delighted to take an opportunity to introduce Mr. Arvind Jaikumar Iyer to you all. He is an experienced technology leader with a passion for using cutting-edge technologies in novel ways that enable ROI, positive digital transformation for client partners. Proven expertise in enterprise adoption, IIoT, cloud, and analytics with over a decade of enterprise-level problem-solving experience. Clients have included major firms in manufacturing, e-commerce, utilities, travel, transportation, social impact, and education, etc. Arvind Jaikumar Iyer, currently working as delivery manager and principal solutions at Affine Analytics Private Limited, Bengaluru. The firm helps over 45 Fortune 500 firms drive their analytics-driven enterprise transformation efforts. He worked as a senior implementation specialist, e-commerce, loyalty, and merchandising delivery at Sabre Corporation, Bengaluru, India. The Fortune 500 firm is one of the largest travel technology solutions provider in the world. He's a co-founder of Aqua Analytics, Oxford, United Kingdom, an analytics provider that helps stakeholders in the water, sanitation, and hygiene, wash sector improve efficiency in data-driven manner. He also worked as executive assistant to the country director India at Safe Water Network, New Delhi. The firm is leading social enterprise in the wash sector that develops affordable and economically viable solution for improving water across US, Ghana, and India. He also worked as research engineer, Advanced Process Control Division at Aditya Birla Science and Technology Company Private Limited, Mumbai. It is the corporate research and development division of a Fortune 500 Indian conglomerate with annual revenues about 40 billion US dollars. Now coming to academic credentials of Mr. Arvind Jaikumar Iyer. Mr. Arvind holds a Master's from Business Administrations, Masters of Business Administration degree from SET Business School, University of Oxford, United Kingdom. Mr. Arvind has a Bachelor in Electronics and Instrumentation Engineering from Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani, Goa, India. Mr. Arvind has a Bachelor of Law with first class from Osmania University, Hyderabad, India. Mr. Arvind has various certifications to his crown. Some of them are AWS Fundamentals by Amazon Web Services, Ultrex Design Course Certified. He's a Green Belt Six Sigma Lean certifier. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of our program. We feel privileged to have you with us. Now I hand over the session to Mr. Arvind Iyer Jaikumar. Before handing over the session to Arvind Iyer Jaikumar, I just request all the participants, delegates to put their video on so that we can take the photos for our record purpose. Kindly, all the delegates, please put your videos on for the photo session. Kishore sir, are we done? Thank you, delegates. I just hand over the session to Mr. Arvind Jaikumar Iyer. So,
Thank you, ma'am.
So shall I start sharing screen?
Yes, that would be helpful. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your time on a Saturday for being here. And thank you again, Pallavi ma'am, for the very kind words of introduction. Thank you also for the other delegates for being here and for sharing their knowledge with the rest of the team. So some ground rules for this particular session. I was hoping that it will be a sort of free-flowing conversation. I've tried to give enough structure to this topic and make it as relevant to all of you, since you're coming from a management standpoint. So I'm just hoping that you can, whenever you have any questions, you can just type it in the chat, or you feel free to interrupt me in case you need any clarifications. And hopefully this will be a session where I can give you all something to take away, which will potentially be of value. So can you please go to the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so in terms of the introduction, I think the about me was covered. So just to briefly recap, I have about 12 years of work experience in basically business problem solving, consulting, sales, partnership development, product delivery, service delivery. So I've had an opportunity to work across a wide range of problems in a wide range of contexts. And essentially, it was working in such circumstances that led me to the world of management. I did my MBA at Oxford a couple of years ago, but that was almost after 8, 9 years of continuous work experience in India. And it was after that that I realized that management is pretty much a critical tool, even at a technology level, and not just beyond the business level, for us to be able to solve important problems. The truth is that the world we live in today is constantly having a lot more technology enter into it, and the ability to leverage that and use it in business context is absolutely critical if we are going to derive new forms of value as we go along in the future. And why case studies play a particularly critical role in that area is because when we discuss cases in a group, and when we are able to share multiple perspectives around the problem from our experiences or from our hypothesis or our understanding, we are in a position to essentially think our entire understanding of the business context and our solutioning becomes much more richer and much more diverse. By being able to take all of these different views, considering all of these different frameworks, and bringing all that together to solve these problems, that becomes the critical utility of case studies, essentially. uh, that's there right now. Now, case studies in the past, which have been solely business focused, are still very much relevant today. And the case studies of the future, I predict, will start to integrate a lot more depth in terms of operational capabilities, in terms of functional expertise, and in terms of technology. So I think that those kinds of cases are already beginning to appear. And considering those cases will tend to actually add a lot of value from our ability for our ability in terms of creating new business models or improving on existing business models and such like. So I hope that gives you some sense of what is the importance of case studies and why it's important to consider these case studies. As Pallavi ma'am also had mentioned, uh, case studies are a way for us to contemplate about a business problem from multiple angles. And these are not just limited to business problems, they're also there in the law, they're very much there in psychology, they're there in a lot of other things. So the objective or the idea behind case studies is to have a narrow, well-defined world in which you go about solving a problem, and you don't essentially do what is called boiling the ocean. So you don't consider things that are just out of scope, way beyond what is needed. So hopefully this session will help you structure your thoughts better, create these business problems better, understand how to solve these in a much more simple and clear-cut fashion, so that you're not really going to have confusions in how you're coming across and how you're presenting yourself and your thoughts in a client-facing situation. So uh, now, what was the historical reasoning behind cases? Case studies have been majorly popularized by the Harvard Business School. So before that, when we used to talk about management, the origins of management thinking starts with someone called Frederick Taylor, who did something called scientific management in the 1800s. And then you had very many pioneers who started to add to a lot of that thinking in terms of what is management theory and things like that. So there was a huge theoretical aspect of management that began to evolve over the mid 1800s onto the early 1950s. And then you start to see another trend where people began to realize that all of these different conceptual and theoretical concepts, we need to actually help apply years in a practical context. And with studies becoming one of the modes each businesses trying to teach business to different people. That is evolution in general. Again, the motive is you should be able to use your theoretical understanding in a practical, applied and an applicable scenario. So that's the whole idea behind understanding case studies and trying to solve them, because you're going to compress a lot of your knowledge and present it in a business-friendly manner. And finally, how do you get better at solving case studies? There is no trick to it. There's just a lot of practice and practicing with a wide variety of people, as many as you can, and understanding what you need to practice. So it's not just practice that makes perfect, but it is perfect practice that makes perfect. So if you end up practicing something incorrectly, you also make that incorrect thing very strong with practice. So understanding what is the right way to do it is as important as practicing. So perfect practice makes perfect, not just practice makes perfect. So as long as you're aware of this, I'm sure you will do very well when it comes to solving case study problems. Yep. So what is consulting, right? So why do we do case studies? What is the practical utility of case studies beyond, let's say, interviews for management consulting jobs in, say, McKinsey, Bain, BCG, the Big Four, PwC, EY, and all of these guys? So what is the use of solving case studies beyond just cracking an interview for these management consulting firms or getting into early management level roles and things like that? The primary use of this is to understand that ultimately the key takeaway that you need to have after all of your case study solving experience is you need to be able to apply this in a live, practical business environment where nobody's going to tell you that there is an exam here. It is going, if you don't solve this correctly, you're going to be rejected. There is a pass mark. It's not like that, right? In a live, practical situation, what you have in front of you is a client, and that client needs to be convinced that you are an expert and that you are concerned about the client's well-being. So if this alignment is there, only if this fundamental trust is there between the client and the consultant, will you be able to do anything. So there are three golden rules of consulting, which you can break only at your own peril. And no matter what you do, how you solve a case problem is as important as solving the problem. So people are not just interested in the answer, they're interested in your reasoning, they're interested in your attitude, your aptitude. It is not just about solving the problem, it is about solving the problem in a client friendly way. So how you solve the problem is as important as correctly solving the problem. So that's the first, in my opinion, the golden rule of consulting, which you must never break in absolutely any scenario. The second golden rule of consulting, what is the difference between a consultant, a management consultant, and pretty much everybody else who works in the business world, is that a management consultant will never, ever tell you something without a data driven justification. So they will never present an emotional standpoint to you. They will never present something that is something that they feel is correct. They will never cherry pick evidence. Any good management consultant will only speak from the perspective of what the data is telling. They will never speak from the perspective of what they feel is right, what they think is right, what they feel the client should be doing, what they feel is the situation. That is not how any good consultant works. Any good consultant is always data driven and never concept driven, never theory driven, never emotional driven. They are first primarily data driven, because a consultant's advice is heard not just from clients, it is heard right up to the CEO, CIO, CTO level. When you are a management consultant for an external firm, you are being hired by that firm. You're not being just hired by one or two people on the other side. You're being hired by that firm. And anything you tell them, if it is good enough, will actually get escalated right to the top. So never, if you want that to happen, never speak without data. So that's the first thing. The second thing is never ever emboss the truth. So there is a very big what happens in situations is many experience will think to get the. It's like how people interviews and anything at all the job. So it's like job and then it out like if the whole idea is just getting. Same thing is true. It's the same consulting. So people who look or just to uh, or just or get that job or saying whatever they think is end up shooting their without actually but absolutely sorry I just dropped off there for a second. Can you hear me okay?
We could hear now, sir, but there was a connectivity issue, I think. We couldn't hear your voice clearly.
Okay, just let me know if that happens so I can switch my network.
Okay.
Yes. So as I was saying, it is absolutely critical in a management consulting standpoint to be often right. And if you are even going to have that doubt that what you're saying needs to be verified, needs to be checked, it needs to be run through by somebody else needs to come in and see and check and cross verify, never commit, never say an answer that may be radically wrong. And if there is any risk that you are going to look really really foolish and really wrong, the golden rule is don't say it. Just don't say it. Tell them it is okay to go back, check, come back to them, but the idea is to be often right. You must never make a mistake in committing or telling something to the client that you are not able to justify with a data driven justification. If you do not have that, you do not say anything, or you ask for more data, or you ask for more time to solve the problem, but you never speak something that you cannot justify in a data driven manner. So that's the second major golden rule of consulting. If you break this, you do it at your own risk. And no matter what people tell you, breaking this will end up costing you quite heavily, either in the long term or in the medium term. So consulting is a small world. And when you're talking to leaders, again, that's a very small world. You have very few companies in India, not more than 90,000, 80,000 or whatever. The word will spread very quickly that you are a bullshitter if you end up saying something that is not correct and if it is not justified. So break this at your own peril is what I would say for the second rule. And finally, the third rule, it goes back to what was the original idea, which is that it is a small world. When you become a good consultant, or if you become noteworthy as a consultant, a lot of people will know you fairly quickly and really fast. And you must never forget that saying something or doing something that will make you look, will put you in a poor light over the long term or the medium term will hurt you pretty hard. So never forget that at any point in time, you just don't represent yourself. You represent your firm, you represent your schooling, you represent your effort that you put to be there. Never ever, uh, never ever make that look or never forget to give it the importance that deserves, that it deserves, right? To be there at that moment, and don't do anything that might essentially create any kind of a negative impression about these things. So never forget, you need to be as ethical as possible and be as straight as possible. And if you're not there yet, there is no harm in working your way towards being deserving of whatever it is that you want to achieve. So you may or may not get everything you want in life, but you can always work to be deserving of it. So these are the three basic rules of consulting. Break these at your own peril, as I said. Can we go? Yeah. So now let's just talk about case studies themselves. Broadly, you're going to encounter in your experience, you're going to have two kinds of case studies that you generally encounter. So one will be the Harvard Business School type cases, which are fairly famous. There will be these uh, business scenario problems where you'll have the use of frameworks. You'll have to use some stuff like Porter's five forces, and you'll have all of these other standard frameworks that you'll apply. And then you might essentially try solving those problems that way. There'll be a lot of discussions. People will share their perspectives. So that is a general HBS case, and that's useful in a group setting environment. It's helpful to learn that in order to be able to contribute to teams when you go into your workforce. and when you're collaborating with other partners. So HBS case studies are really good from the perspective of team discussions, from the perspective of having diverse views and diverse thinking coming into solving the problem. And that kind of environment is well fostered by HBS cases. So that's the first kind of case. The second that you are going to encounter at an individual level, generally speaking. So it'll either happen when you're trying to talk to a client, either for a job or for a consulting assignment, or if you're trying to solve problems on the ground with the client. So that will be the second kind of category, which will be case interview problems, which is what largely this discussion is going to be about. The second thing that you need to remember is that you need to learn for case interview problems primarily. You need to understand both perspectives, that the interviewer and the interviewee are very different. The interviewer's goal and requirements and rules are fairly straightforward. The interviewer wants, in almost all cases, they want only a few things and they want that to be as clear as possible. But the interviewee's role tends to be a lot more dynamic because it is the interviewee who's responding to the business problem. They are structuring it for the interviewer. They have a lot of leeway as to how they can take that problem, which direction can they take, what can they do, where do they investigate the issue, and what do they do about presenting it to the client. So the interviewee has a lot more power to actually structure and give the general direction to a case. Whereas the interviewer is actually in practical situations, an interviewer will not often have an answer in their mind. Instead, they're looking to the interviewee to basically help reach that conclusion. This is true again in a practical work. Sorry, can you please mute the?
One second.
Ramya madam, please be on mute. Mohan sir.
Great. And finally, we must understand that these case study problems will have different objectives in different settings. So sometimes you'll have to present case studies as part of a LegDem or as part of a workshop, or if you're part of a panel. So you'll have the opportunity to talk about cases there. In a classroom environment, again, cases will be presented and used in a very structured fashion that can happen. Another place where case studies tend to be presented differently will be in an interview setting. And finally, as I mentioned, a work environment where you'll have a client, they will just have a broad problem and they are looking to you to set the direction of the solutioning as well as the understanding of how you get to basically present that problem in a business friendly fashion. So can we move the next slide? Great. So as I mentioned, for case study problems, the interviewer's mindset is fairly straightforward. So what the average life of an interviewer, whether it is a business client or whether it is the interviewer who actually is taking your job interview sort of, or a case study interview sort of requirement, what is their actual life, if you think about it? Everybody who works in these companies, especially when you're working with a lot of people, one of the first things that they often feel is the lack of independence, because you have to work with so many people, you have to collaborate across a lot of things. So they are feeling this thing where they have all of these things that need to be done. They don't have enough time for themselves, and they just want to get done with this as fast as possible in the best manner possible. So what they're looking for is, if you're 80% right, and you are like you're not perfectly right, it's fine. And they just want a structured thing from you. They don't want to see you think through everything in the world when you're faced with a business problem. They just want you to have like some basic structure that you're able to clearly tell them, okay, this is what you need to think about, and let me go think about this, come back to you later and clarify whether this is what you want or what. So what they're looking for is not a lecture. They're looking for things that they can go think about and come back to you for questions. So that's the second piece that they're looking for. And as I mentioned, right, they are not looking at precision on the first meeting or even in a immediate consulting engagement. So that is what they're looking for is just good enough at the start, and they're not looking for absolute precision. So don't stress out that you've not covered everything or you have to say everything and stuff. What they're looking for is just have a lot of consideration for their time. Try not to show them everything you know on the first step, in the first step itself, and try to be good enough instead of just being absolutely precise. Try to be structured, cover 80% of the stuff you need to talk about, and don't worry about the remaining 20%. Don't boil the ocean, meaning don't talk about everything, don't consider everything in the world when you talk about business. Just stick to the problem at hand, stick to some functional area. And that's pretty much what they're looking to see. From you at any point in time, whether you're a consultant, whether you're interviewing, whatever it is, what everybody wants to see is you have a process that when you're going to solve these problems, they want to see how you arrived at that conclusion, whether you have a clear process to reach there, or whether it was just a lucky guess. So a lot of people are very good intuitive problem solvers. But if you ask them to explain this, it'll be really difficult for them to explain this. Right? And in India's case, it is particularly common that many Indians, right from childhood, they're taught to be very good intuitive problem solvers, but they are not very process driven, right? So process driven problem solving is very different from intuitive problem solving. And I can give you a good example of this. If you take even Srinivasa Ramanujan, who was our probably one of the greatest mathematicians of the last century, uh, Ramanujam also never explained most of his thesis. So if you see his notebooks, which are still available for viewing at Cambridge, you basically will notice that he will write the first line of the problem. The second line will actually be 5 logical steps or 10 logical steps jump. So he will not even explain all that. He will just directly go off next step. And in a live situation, that's very impressive. But for businesses, that's actually a scary thing to see someone who's making all these giant leaps without being able to explain every intermediate step. So for them, it's a risk component. Looking at someone who is just being intuitively really good at problem solving, they're able to get to the answer really quickly. That's actually seen as a risky thing as compared to someone who is methodical, who is process oriented. They have a clear structure and framework that they are thinking through this. So that is the first thing that businesses want. They want to see a process thinking rather than an intuitive thinking, and it's just a clear. The solution is not as important as how you get there, because when you do it in a live practical environment, when you're trying to implement this consulting recommendations in a live practical scenario, people need to understand how and why you thought through these steps, so that in case there is something in a practical sense that changes, they need to understand the logic behind how you got it. Second piece is they always want to say, as I mentioned, data driven, data driven, data driven. You never speak anything without data. If basically you say the house is on fire, what I'm expecting you to say as a consultant is, look, you're in a 1600 SFT house. The current rate of burn is about 15 SFT per second. You have approximately 100 seconds to get out of there. So I suggest you move for the door right now. That is the kind of answer I'm expecting from a consultant, and not someone who's just like screaming the head off saying the house is burning, the fire is there, you are going to die or what. That's not what I'm expecting. I'm expecting a data driven thing for any scenario. Right? So that is again a consultant's motto. The third thing is, never forget that all of this data it makes it very easy to start talking only about small things. Right? You're just focusing on, you're not looking at the bigger picture. Right? So for example, this happens a lot with people who are functional experts. So a supply chain expert will very, I mean, you'll only see some kinds of experts who will move beyond supply chain and start talking about accounting, for instance, or business finance, or they will talk about how supply chain connects to market. So as a consultant, you are expected to have that bigger picture. You should be able to look at a function and actually talk from the overall business standpoint. So where does this fit in within the organizational structure? Is this a cost center? Is this a revenue center? Or is this a administration center? What is it going to look like? What are you going to get? What is the value? Where does it fit in the org? They're expecting you to have that kind of clarity. So big picture thinking, very much welcome in consulting, but attention to detail, equally critical to being accepted as a great consultant. So both these things are important. And finally, everything is irrelevant if you don't know how to present your conclusions and findings. So you can consider, you might be, in fact, the more you read, the more you know, you can go down and you can talk about something for hours, but people don't have the time. What they have is just minutes, right? And so what they're looking at you for is a 30-second summary of what you've done, or they're asking for 3 top recommendations of what you're talking about. They will come to you again if they want more. But when you are presenting, what they're expecting is key takeaways. They don't want to come back and they don't want to come to you and go back with a full Ramayana in their head. They just want 3 lines that they can go tell their boss, and then he'll be like, yeah, it sounds interesting. Let's investigate this further. Nobody wants detailed, heavy duty stuff. You should have it ready because they will come back and ask it. But when you're presenting to them, what the client is expecting is simple, very short, very quick, easy to consume stuff, and it is not theoretical. It is not all over the place. It is absolutely focused to the business problem and the solution that you need. So that's pretty much how anyone will expect I mean, the general expectation from a case study in almost any live practical scenario. So can we go to the next slide? So yeah, before I move on, any questions or any comments at this stage? Let me just quickly give you a few minutes to let this soak in.
Arvind sir, we have a common practice like the question and answer session will be the last 10 minutes.
I see.
The
Okay.
participant will be asking the questions at the end, or they'll be posting the questions in the chat box whenever they have the doubts.
Got it. Okay, sure. So let me now come to the kinds of problems that you're mostly going to encounter, whether it is at a case interview level. So I'm talking about this, these are the exact kind of problems you're going to interview for in a place like McKinsey or Bain or BCG or any of the other big consulting firms. So the big firms of consulting are what is called the MBB firms. McKinsey, Bain, BCG, they are the absolute prima donna firms from a consulting standpoint. And then you have the big four, which would be EY, PwC, and all of these different kinds of firms. But if you're able to solve MBB style case studies, you can pretty much solve any level of case studies that you will get in any life situation, because these MBB case studies are practical. They are looking for this. These are the case studies that they have experienced with a CEO, with a CTO, CFO. They're presenting to the board. So these are the 5 major areas that those guys will consult on. So let's talk about them one by one. So first of all, guesstimation problems are problems that you will get in a very quick scenario, like in a practical, apart from interviewing, usually in a case study interview rounds, guesstimation will be one of the first problems that they will use for checking whether this person can solve a problem, and can they do it quickly if required, can they give me a logical structure as fast as possible, and it's basically a test of whether your fundamentals are right. The guesstimation means you estimate some problem, but it need not be perfectly right. So you can, it's called, there's a guess as well as an estimation component. So that's why a combination of the two is called guesstimation problem. So let me give you an example of how this might come to you in a interview situation. So you walk into an interview, the interviewer will be like, okay, first tell me what has happened in your CV. And then they will say, okay, great. Then they'll ask you some things that you've done. Okay, great. And then he'll be like, okay, let's start with the first case study problem. Where are you from? So if let's say you say you're from Bangalore, then basically the guy comes to you and he says, okay, what is your favorite drink? Do you like tea or coffee or Bonvita or whatever? You say, okay, I like, let's say I like tea. So he says, okay, so let me give you a problem here to see how you solve this. Can you tell me, I'm a tea company. Let's say I'm Tata Beverages. I want to set up a tea supply or a tea retail business in Bangalore. Tell me, how would I go about it? Or tell me what would be the potential size of my market. So this is how a guesstimation problem will come. It'll be so weird. Like it'll be like, why is he asking me about tea? And then he will take that information and put it into a guesstimation problem, right? Where he will ask you, can you estimate the number of tea or coffee that's sold in Bangalore? So how would you go solving this, right? So you need to solve this in a very, he's expecting not more than 5-6 minutes for you to solve this. He's also expecting that you mentally, if you're able to solve it, that's really good, because in a live situation, he's expecting you to show him something with a pen paper. But nowadays, since everything is pandemic and you're doing everything remotely, they are expecting to actually see you think through and logically conceptualize that problem. So we'll solve this problem. So I suggest you think about how you would solve this problem in a live situation. I came and asked you, how many teas would you use in a day or whatever. So think about it. Or what is the size of the tea market of Bangalore? Or how many computers get sold in Delhi every year? Or let's say you want to be so these are like guesstimation problems. Or it'll be very simple. It'll be like, I want to set up a plant for making masks. So basically, what should be the capacity I should set up for my plant? So these are called guesstimation problems, right? That's the first kind of problem. It will be the major problem that will identify whether you are able to solve quickly, or whether you're able to do stuff. That's the first kind of problem. The second kind of problem, unit economics problems. Why I call them unit economics problems is ultimately when you want to analyze a business and you want to analyze at a fundamental level whether what is that business's existence based on, right? So there's a framework, a simple framework, right? Profit is equal to revenue minus cost, right? It's a very simple logic. Profit for a firm should be greater than zero. Revenue and costs are the two components that make up this profit. Now, how do we use this information along with unit economics? What is unit economics? Unit economics means let's talk about a single unit. So, for example, if there is Dell and say Dell makes computers every year, and let's say that if someone comes to you and you're in a practical, like if you go to a CFO meeting or if you see any of these companies,
language. Okay, that is one coding language.
and if you see this stock market related stuff, what you'll see is you'll see a huge balance sheet. There will be many millions of dollars written over there. You'll be like, yeah, Dell earned a revenue of some 800 million this year, and then there was costs incurred. There is all this goodwill, PP, all of those other stuff that was there in the balance sheet. There's all this asset receivable, accounts receivable, accounts payable, all of these different balance sheets. You'll be looking at all of these numbers, and it is so confusing that you're looking at, like, I'm just seeing all of these huge sets of numbers with all these millions and all this stuff. It's really confusing when you want to explain this to someone in a practical environment. You can't go and tell him I had 893.6 million of sales last year. Along with, it's impressive that you know the number, but it's actually boring from a client perspective. What they want, and the easiest way to structure this is to talk in unit economics terms. So I will say, yes, sir. Basically, Dell makes 1 million computers a year. Each computer is $5 revenue that Dell gets. So Dell's revenue is 5 into 1 million, $5 million a year. So now he has a very clear idea. Okay, my per unit cost is $5. Number of units is X. So X into Y is revenue, right? It's a very simple way to structure in terms of unit economics. You're able to now look at a firm, and a firm might spend on many things, right? It'll have revenue is just cost of each product. I mean, revenue from each product into number of products. If you just think of it like this, everything, all the confusing stuff will vanish, right? So that's your first thing. How do you break down a company's balance sheet into revenue per unit into number of units? Now let's talk about cost. Cost is again two things, right? Cost is fixed cost and operating cost. Fixed cost is a business level cost. You cannot do anything to that cost at a unit level. But operating costs can also be unit level cost. So you can take a unit, there'll be a cost per unit, and there'll be a number of units. You can use that to calculate break-even time. When are you going to recover OPEX plus CAPEX? When are you going to get OPEX plus CAPEX plus interest return? So all of that stuff can be easily constructed with unit economics problems. So let me give you an example of what kind of these, how will you hear these unit economics problems in real life, right? In a practical situation, nobody will tell you that this is a unit economics problem. How you will actually hear it in a live situation is, you go to a CFO, he'll say, "Arey yaar, this month I have had a massive reduction in sales, or the number of customers who have come in is very less, or basically you'll say, I'm thinking of shutting down one of my distribution centers." That is how you will hear about this problem. And when you hear about it like that, you must quickly think about unit economics. Or like, "Arey, where is the problem? Is it going to be in the revenue area or the cost area? In cost, is it going to be a fixed area or it is going to be the operating area?" In again revenue area, you will look at it and say, okay, is there a problem with actually how much you're charging at a per product level, or is there an issue at how many products itself get sold? Why did that happen? So you're able to deep dive into your framework. Okay, sorry, I just dropped off there again for a second. I hope you can hear me okay now.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so that's unit economics problems, right? The third one is mergers and acquisitions. So there are a lot of practical situations where a guy will come to you and say, okay, my company does not have capacity in, say, I'm a big company, I don't have capacity in AI or ML. Now, if I have to hire a guy, train him for 3 years or 1 year or whatever, and then in between he gets bored and he leaves to another company or he got a better salary, my investment in training that guy has yielded nothing to me as a company, right? So it's a complete waste for me to do it at a one-person individual level. So what I will generally think is, in a practical sense, I want this capacity in 1 month or 5 months or 6 months. Why don't we just acquire a firm that's doing it? There's another firm that's basically selling data analytics. let's just buy that firm. Let's just bring them in a project and let's talk about buying them later. So those are mergers and acquisition situations. Similarly, if you're going to say, I am a salesperson, I am a marketing company. I'm thinking how to reduce my costs even further. Why don't I buy a manufacturing unit, which is back-end integration? Similarly, you'll have forward integration, backward integration, where you're doing upstream stuff, you're buying stuff, you're doing downstream stuff, again, you're buying stuff. So that's again a merger and acquisition problem. Similarly, demerger problems will be there. Like you'll have huge conglomerates that decide to just spin off entities. Like for example, the good example of this is, let's say, the Piramal Group. The Piramal Group is a huge pharmaceutical giant a few years ago. They decided to spin it off and basically get rid of that. And today the Piramal brand is a little different. It does not work in pure the pharmaceutical space that they were very famous for a few years. So that is again an example of a mergers and acquisition style problem that you will get in a practical situation. The fourth is business situation problems, which is very similar to what HBS case studies will cover. So HBS case studies and business situation problems are pretty much the same. The way you will typically hear about these problems will be like, let's say you want to enter a new market. You're right now operating in Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka. You want to improve and set up capacity in the Northeast. Or let's say you want to set up capacity in Bangladesh. Or let's say you want to move into Thailand. So that's one example of what is a business situation. Is it worth going in? How do you think about that problem? Is it worth for us to try entering that market? Or let's say you want to launch a new product. I have to invest in creating this product, do R&D, do a marketing plan, do a launch plan. Then I have to spend couple of years to basically put the sales force behind it. Everybody should get in a practical situation where they're trying to launch this product. I need to think through before I make those investments, whether it's going to be possible or profitable for me, right? That's again a business case problem. Similarly, a new business itself, like I mentioned, forward, backward integration. Sometimes in different sectors, like for example, let's say you're Coca-Cola and you have only been making soda drinks. And basically now people are saying that health is going to be a new area. Why don't we start a new health drink business? So basically that's a new business case situation. So there are a lot of things like that. There will be turnaround is another famous situation. How are you placed with respect to your competitors? How do you react to them? So your customers' behavior might be changing. COVID has come. Suddenly they were buying cars. Now everybody's stuck at home. What is the use of buying cars? So why to buy cars? Similarly, you will have real estate problem. All of this stuff is how do you respond to these things? That's traditionally a business situation problem. And then you have finally the fifth category. Traditionally, I would put these under business situation, but why I'm putting these separately is because these problems can actually go through. They might use components of the other problems. So for capacity expansion, you might use a bit of estimation, you might use a bit of unit economics, you'll use a bit of acquisition stuff, and you might also have business situations involved, which is why I would put them into a separate category. And how will you usually again encounter this in a practical situation is, I'll have a new capacity because of merger and acquisition. So greenfield expansion will give me one type of capacity improvement. Brownfield expansion will give me another type of capacity improvement. Brownfield means existing setup, let me add more capacity. Greenfield means I don't have that setup. Let me buy the land, set up the plant, set up all of this new stuff for doing it. So that is greenfield expansions for a particular plant. Similarly, mergers and acquisitions will give you new capacities. So maybe you're a manufacturing firm, you bought a services firm. Now you're able to serve even the product at a manufactured product. You're also able to sell services. So you have a new capacity capability at that. So that's capacity type problems. Similarly, you will have, I think, if you guys do microeconomics in your MBA, you'll tend to have these things called supply demand curves, customer surplus, producer surplus, first order, second order, third order equilibrium. These are really important, right? Because this stuff is not well understood, but when it is used in a correct situation at a C level, they really appreciate this. If a consultant comes in there with a clarity, how microeconomics, how accounting and all of these things tie together with all of these practical problems, they'll really appreciate it. So demand issues, supply issues, and most importantly, cost of expansion. So when you improve capacity, you're going to spend something. Is it worth spending that money to improve the capacity? That's very important for us to analyze and understand. Right? So that is the 5 types of problems. So let's just quickly deep dive into the next part. Okay, so let me give you an example, so that a live example of how we would solve a guesstimation problem. So as I mentioned, I go to I have an interview, and an analyst comes to me and he says, uh, I can do analytics. I'm very good at business. I have done MBA. I've done everything. I know this, that, and all. I'm very confident. I've seen YouTube videos. I think I'm a professional. So there are people who come with a lot of confidence. Like, nobody wants to feel like they are not an expert. But when they come, the way I will test it is the guesstimation problem. Tell me how you will solve this. So let me give you an example of how we would solve the, let's say, the T problem that I said in Bangalore. So the first thing is, let's talk about how do we solve the T problem. So let me recap. It will come to you very simply, these kind of estimation problems. And it's just an example. Like, you are in Bangalore, your favorite drink is tea, and they come to you and they say, Tata Beverages or Coke or someone wants to set up a tea unit in Bangalore. So what should be my capacity that I should set up? Or what will be the potential market that I have in Bangalore? So how do we solve this? So first, let us take a top-down approach. Right now, as I mentioned, there is no need for you to be perfectly right. What they are looking for is your approach, your thinking. So how do I solve this problem? And you can tell me whether you found it to be a logical way of approaching this or not. So the top-down approach is very simple. I will say, okay, sir or madam, let's assume I have 5 million or 10 million people in Bangalore, and I'll ask the interview, is that a good assumption? Interviewer will say, yeah, it's a good assumption or a bad assumption. Why don't we take it as 1 million? Why don't we take it as 5 million? Or he will say 10 million is fine. So let's assume here that the guy says 10 million is fine. So I have 10 million people in Bangalore. I will assume, madam, that at a high level, I want to quickly first solve this problem. So there will be many ways I can categorize these 10 million people. So some of them will be children 0 to 10, 15 years of age. Others will be 15 to 65 years of age. And 65 plus will be another demography. So there will also be male and female drinkers. There will also be affluent and basically middle class and basically poor. So different ways to categorize. I don't want to waste your time right now, madam. Let me just start with the top-down approach. I have 10 million people. Out of the 10 million people, I just want to assume that I think about 20% of them drink tea on average. 20% people drink tea out of the 10 million. And on average, these 20% tea drinkers drink around 2 cups of tea a day. So how much is my market size? Immediately in a second, what I will get is 10 million into 20%, which is 2 million, and into 2 cups of tea. So I have 4 million cups of tea a day. That is my capacity. For each cup of tea, I'll assume, madam, that 10 grams is my cup of tea, is basically one. So 10 million into 0.01 kg is basically the kilograms of tea that I will need to make. So that's basically 400,000 kilograms or 4 lakh kilograms. So that's basically 400 tons. I will need 400 tons of tea is the capacity that Bangalore can take. If I set up a plant with that capacity, I can take care of Bangalore, if this assumption is correct. To better make this assumption, I will do segmentation. I can give you a much better answer if you give me some time. I will break it up and I will tell you, like, this is how you will solve that problem, a live situation. So that you have given them an answer, you have told them your preliminary approach. Then you say, to improve this answer, I will improve the segmentation. I will take the affluent people, middle class, poor. I will take how much tea. Some people are heavy tea drinkers, some people low tea drinkers, some people want like this, like that. So you can use segmentation later, right? But top down, in just 2 minutes, I have given him an estimate that around 400 tons, I think, will be the estimate, right? Now, that is the first exam. Similarly, if they say, what is the market potential in that same question, then you will say, okay, 400 tons I have. Approximately, I think my revenue per ton will be 10,000, 15,000 or 1 lakh or what. And so what you say is 400 tons, it's 1 lakh. I'm going to get about 4 crores revenue per day. If it is 400 rupees a ton in terms of revenue, it will be a lot more. But if you keep asking the interviewer, is 400 rupees a good assumption? Is 1,000 rupees a good assumption? And if they say yes, no, whatever it is, you are not worried about what is the number that changes. The logic is correct, means you can put any number and the answer will come correctly. So that is the top-down approach of solving this. Now let us solve the same problem from bottoms-up approach. So what we are saying, let's say you want to solve the same problem from a bottom-up approach. So how you will start? You will say, I think generally, madam, a tea drinker will drink 2 cups of tea a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. And approximately, I think out of every 100 people, I think around 2-3 people will drink tea. So out of every 100 people, if let's say 2 people drink tea or 20 people drink tea, whatever it is, how many out of every 100 people I'm getting 40 cups of tea that is getting consumed, 2 into the 20 or whatever it is. So 40 cups of tea for every 100 people are getting consumed. Now I think approximately Bangalore will have 1 million people. So I will divide that 1 million by 100 multiplied by 40. That is the number of cups I'm getting. This is the bottom-up approach to solving the exact same problem. In the top-down approach, I took the broad population, broke it down, and came down further, and finally got the answer. In a bottom-up approach, I start with a single individual, and I build up the case. Individual has 2 teas, then he takes it. He has tea 5 days a week. There are many ways to structure that bottom-up thing, but the logical flow is you're starting at a particular level and you're building upwards in bottom. Finally, you have segmentation approach. Now, segmentation is very important when you actually solve these business problems, because people want detail, right? They want to understand. You can't just go and say, yeah, I think out of 100 million, 20% only will have tea. That's not a good enough answer. What if you're going to give a presentation, what they're expecting is at least a slide will talk about what is the total population, how much percentage male, demographics, consumption pattern, behaviors, all of this stuff. They want to see that you have segmented these well. And for those segments, you're able to estimate their consumption well. And then when you add up, you get a much better sense. So why this is useful, the company might come in and say, okay, tea is a very general thing. I want to actually have high margin tea. High margin tea is one type of tea. Then black tea is a low margin tea. Tea leaves is another type of low margin tea or whatever. So if suppose you say high margin teas, what will be my total size of market? So for high margin tea, which are costly teas, number of users are less. But your market size is again revenue per user into number of users. So let's say you have 1,000 rupees you get from a guy, but there are only 10 users. The value of that is 10,000 rupees. Whereas let's say you make only 1 rupee on a cheap tea, but there are 10,000 people who are taking, you're again going to get 1 rupee in 10,000. The revenue is the same, right? And your effort is also different. Like to market a high cost tea, you'll have to spend a lot more money than marketing a low cost tea, for example. I'm just saying every situation is different, but this will give you a better, the business, when it takes the decision, it'll be like, I'm setting up capacity. Let me set up for high margin, medium margin, or let me set up for low margin, little bit of medium margin, little bit of high margin. So that segmentation is very important for them to take a lot of decisions, like at a marketing level, at a production level, at a capacity planning level, at many levels, right? So that is a utility of the segmentation approach in a practical live situation. So that's guesstimation problems. And you can let me know if you have any other questions around this. So let's just move on. Yeah, so the second piece is unit economics problem. As I mentioned, these problems are typically framed in this manner. There's been a profit decline. There has been a price decline. I was charging 10 rupees, now I'm charging 5 rupees. Then I have a volume decline. I used to sell 1 million units, now I'm selling only 1,000 units. Or there is a cost increase or a cost decrease, or whatever it is. These are how you will see these unit economic problems usually presented to you. The framework, as I mentioned, is very simple, right? Any unit economics problem can be solved with this framework that you see in front of you. These are the logical steps basically to solve that problem. Simple. Profit is revenue minus cost. And remember, simplicity is the most important key in business. Right? The more complex the topic, and the simpler must be your language, because it is very difficult to be simple and very easy to confuse everybody with a lot of high sounding words. Nobody respects that. Basically, everybody only wants simplicity for complicated problems. The more complicated the problem, the simpler should be your approach to solving. So that is the key thing that you must never forget. Right? The framework here is profit is revenue minus cost. Revenue is unit revenue into number of units. And then you have cost, which is two things, right? Either unit cost or into number of units, or you can also see the same thing as unit fixed cost, unit variable cost, or net fixed cost, net unit cost. So this is a framework that you have. You break down revenue and cost in the same way. You look at unit cost, at unit fixed cost, unit variable cost. Sometimes you might not get unit fixed cost. So you might get a business cost, which will be a business fixed cost. Let's say he'll tell you, I have to put $10 million to set up a plant. Is it worth? So if suppose your $10 million, the minimum fixed investment you have to, then the thing will be how many variable units must you sell for this to become profitable. Right? So that will again come in unit variable cost. So when you put this in a practical situation, when you try to solve these unit economic problems practically, using this framework will help you structure your thinking and present it in a business friendly manner. So that is the overall framework that I would use for these unit economics problems in general. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right. So these are business situation problems. So as I mentioned, this is traditionally the types of problems that you will see: new market entry, new product launch, new business upstream, downstream integrations, or a completely different line of work itself. Then how do we grow? They'll just come and tell you, I have this, how do we grow? It'll just be such a generic problem that you'll have to think through a lot of things before you answer. Similarly, they will ask you, what should be my strategy? How do I turn around this business? It's been making losses, or this division has been making losses. How do I change it? Similarly, my company position, I right now have only 1% market share or 5% market share. How do I improve my market share? Or I'm a market leader. How do I improve the size of the market itself for me to make it profitable? Similarly, response to new behavior by either customers or competitors. Right? Now, the framework to solving it, these problems, is what is seen in the next line that you have. Any business situation problem can be broken down into 4 major components that you must investigate step by step to solve. One is you must consider the customer. What is the customer doing? Who is the customer? Where is the customer? What is their capacity to pay? What is their willingness to pay? Where are they? Or what is their age, demography, job? All of those questions get done at a customer level. Second is, what is the actual product or service that the company is engaged in? Is it a services company or is it a product company? Which product, what service, who is paying, how long, how is it paid, how is it earned, how do you staff, how do you deploy? All of those questions will get considered at a product service level. Third is the company itself. Now, every company and organization has its own behavior and has its own requirements. Some companies will have some functions, some companies will not have those functions. All of this is important. You have to consider a business situation from the perspective of the implementing company itself. So that's another area of investigation. Finally, you have competition. Now, this competition is very, very useful when you talk in a management consulting world, because traditionally everybody only is inward looking. Like if you go anywhere, nobody will look at what others are doing beyond their company. Like you go to a company, a boss will be worried about what his bosses think of him, what his colleagues think of him, what his subordinates think of him. Nobody will worry about what the neighboring company, who he is not even heard or seen, what they are doing or what they are thinking of. So the competition aspect, but when you present it in a practical situation, that is a very effective tool to make these companies suddenly think of change and suddenly think of upgrading themselves and making some new things and following some new recommendations. So that is a very secret tool that is used to drive organizational change from a consulting standpoint. Talking about the competition, awareness of competition, that's a really good way to analyze these problems as well. So the framework that you broadly use for business situation problems are customer, product service, company, and competition. So that's the way to solve these problems. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. Mergers and acquisitions, again, as I mentioned, very simple. They will just ask you, is a merger a good idea, or should we do a demerger? Should we do a demerger? Should we do a merger? Is it a good idea? When is it a good idea? What are the types of acquisitions that might make sense for us? So these are ways to do this. How do you solve this? Very simple, right? You the same framework as the previous thing, where you're using customer, product, company, competition. But now what you're going to do is you're going to analyze this individually as well as collectively. So you look at company A, you'll see its customer, product, company, and competition. You look at company B, you will see that it has different capabilities for customers, different capabilities for product, different capability for company and competition. And then you'll see the amalgamated version of these two. These two things come together, and then you have a new capability that gets created. See, in only mathematics is 1 plus 1 equal to 2. In business, 1 plus 1 is never equal to 2. It'll either be less than 2 or it'll be more than 2. What do I mean by that? If a merger or if two people combine and work in a team, you will notice that either the work productivity gets worse because the team members are fighting with each other, or it becomes infinitely better than just if those two people are working on it independently. So in only in mathematics, 1 plus 1 equal to 2. In live business situation, 1 plus 1 is very rarely equal to 2. It is very rare. So that is the logical understanding that you should take when you think about practical mergers and acquisitions. So when you bring these two together, it is going to be better than having these two individually. That is the idea. If that is the case, it's a good merger, right? So we can go on. Yeah, so capacity change problems, as I said, the way they'll come out is capacity change, merger and acquisition. I want to build or shut down a factory. Should I do it? Or basically, I want to either do greenfield or brownfield expansion. Is it worth doing it? In all of these cases, what you'll have to consider is the factors influencing demand, the factors influencing supply, and what is the cost of expansion. So in a lot of cases, actually in practical situations, you will know whether it's a good idea or not. Any idea in a business sense is a good idea or not by just looking at how much money are you going to put to get what kind of return, right? That is what is that is the biggest, the secret solution basically to finding whether it is worth putting that effort to create this capacity or stuff like that. So I'll give you a practical example of this. So for example, let's say that I am setting up a computer manufacturing or a semiconductor plant. Because India wants to make in India and we don't have semiconductors here. Let's say I want to set up a semiconductor plant. Government is telling me I'll give you this, that, all these facilities, but still you observe that many businesses don't invest. Government is telling I will give you 5 million, 10 million, I'll give you 10%, this, that, all these things. But somehow you will notice that a practical, intelligent businessman will not invest. Why he will not invest? I'll give you an example. In the case of semiconductor manufacturing, let us say that the cost of manufacturing a semiconductor chip is $1. Let us say, basically, let us say my profit is 50 cents. So which means I'm almost getting 50% profit for $1. When I put $1, I'm getting almost 50% on top of it as revenue. So that's my operating margin. Now, it might sound like a very good idea. You'll be like, if any product I'm making, and if my operating margin is 50%, if you actually do an analysis of our Indian stock market, you will notice that there are very few companies that have that kind of phenomenal operating margin ranges. Very many companies will work in operating ranges of 5, 10, 15, 20%. Very rarely you will get beyond 50%. So let us assume that in this case, you will get 50%. So you put $1, you'll get 50%. But now I come and tell you, I will need to spend $5 billion to basically set up this semiconductor manufacturing plant. So my fixed cost is $5 billion. My production cost is $1 per unit. My profit is 50 cents. Just take, is it worth putting that investment, right? Now, when we break down that problem at a practical level, what we will see is, if $5 billion is my spend at capex level, I will need to sell 10 billion semiconductor units at a profit of 50 cents per unit to even recoup my investment. Just without, I'm not assuming interest rate, I am not assuming all of the other stuff. Just at a fundamental level, for me to recoup that cost, I have to sell 5 billion units. India's population itself is 1 billion, 1.4 billion. How am I going to sell 5 billion semiconductor chips for a country of just 1.5 billion people? It makes no sense. The cost of expansion is not worth it. And this is a very simple way to say that it is not worth investing that money. I will not put that investment. So that's an example of a capacity change problem in a practical situation. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to give you, before I move on, just a a few things that you need to remember when you solve cases live. First thing is always stall for time. Never start with the answer. First thing when you get a case given to you is calm down. Right? Take a deep breath. Don't jump into solving the problem. First thing is take some time, ask questions, uh, try to get that framework that you will need to proceed. Without a framework, don't proceed. Process oriented problem solving, not problem solving. Problem solving, anybody can do. Process orientation is what is the most important. So if I go and tell in a public situation, 1+1 is not equal to 2, people will think I'm an idiot. But if I give you the framework, why I'm saying 1+1 may or may not be equal to 2 in a business situation, that time you'll understand that the framework makes that fact relevant in a different way. So the framework is important. Secondly, always once you get a case, think of what kind of case is it. Some cases need numbers, some cases need business understanding. So that is the difference. What kind of case is it? Third, never think in your brain. You might be a genius, an Einstein in your head, but the customer wants the confidence that they want to be able to understand how you're going about this. So that anything happens, they can contribute. So never do this problem solving in your head. Only in examination, it is worth thinking in your head. In practical life, it is best to think out loud, right? So that is because uh, that's just fundamental, right, in case study solving. Fourth, take your time to clarify everything. Never make assumptions in your head. Always talk out that assumption loudly, ask people, and then only go for it. Similarly, repeat everything. A person says, I want to solve this problem. Or make sure once you understand it, you repeat it back to them so that you reconfirm whatever they've said, what their expectation is. Because mismatch of expectations is the key problem. All client consultant problems come because expectation mismatch. For that, you must repeat everything, document everything, make sure everybody's aligned. That is very, very important. As I mentioned, no assumptions. Never make any assumptions beyond what is given to you in that case. Don't make any assumptions beyond what you tell that person. Get the math right. What I mean by that is the math has to be correct also, but it has to be written also. Right? If you write and you use diagrams and you explain all the logical flows, everybody will understand it. If you don't do it, you are basically going to look like an idiot somewhere, because people can you can follow, you can show if you have something written, whereas you can't do that if you don't write. Finally, rounding up, rounding down. 1 million is, so if you get some answer, very weird answer like 86,300 and something, you say approx 90,000, approx 85,000, it's fine, right? But make sure that if I round it upwards, round it downward, tell the guy that what you're doing. And finally, for all cases, make sure that you segment. So you must segment every case in whatever way, right? There must be segmentation, and always clarify with the interviewer whether they want the segmentation to be solved. But never forget to indicate at least that you know segmentation. If we segment, it will be like this. Or do you want me to segment and proceed like this? Clarify that and continue. That will help you solving any case problem in a live situation. So can we just move forward? Next. Okay, so I'll again just deep dive into the idea of thinking about solving cases in a practical classroom environment or in a practical business environment. As I mentioned, when the case problem is first presented to you, first thing is take a deep breath. Never jump into solving it. First thing is take a deep breath and clarify. Restate the case. If they have spoken to you for 3 minutes about the case, take 2 minutes to summarize everything that you've heard in the case and restate it and send it back to them and repeat it so that they are all aligned. Alignment, very important, right? So restate everything. Next thing, make sure that when the case is being told to you, never go into a case situation without writing everything that might be relevant about the case. Even the smallest facts will become very relevant once you deep dive into the frameworks. So make sure you don't miss anything. Very critical to write down everything. Never go into a case. In fact, a consultant's most important arsenal in his toolkit is a notebook. It doesn't matter. No, don't go into any meeting in life without a small pocket notebook and a pen. It doesn't matter. In fact, I tell you, this laptop, mobile, tablets is not as impressive as watching someone pull out a notebook and record it. That is what people respect. Someone who works with their hand. Right? You are a consultant. You must have a notebook and you must have a pen paper with you all the time. If you don't have it, you are basically, it's like going into office without clothes. So notebook is part of your arsenal. That is the uniform of a consultant. Right? You must have it and write down everything. Third, repeat, 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 reclarify, reclarify, reclarify. Don't assume anything. Clarify everything, even if it makes you look like an idiot. Never make the mistake of thinking that what if I look like a fool? What if I that is not conducive for business problem solving. Ultimately, everybody gets paid if the business succeeds, and people can look like fools or heroes or whatever. That is irrelevant. The most important thing is alignment and being sure that the business objective is clear, the value is clear, because ultimately there will be a day when the presentation will get reviewed. The project will get reviewed, and is it a good project or not? The facts will speak for themselves. So clarify, 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 reclarify, reclarify, reclarify. That is what I'm saying. Never assume anything. Repeat everything. There is no harm in looking like an idiot. It is critical that you look like an idiot if you want to solve business problems, because assuming things is the first mistake you make when it comes to not solving the problem. Right? Second thing is about structuring the case. Ultimately, your stage one ends when you have reached the point where you've gotten all the information, you've clarified everything, and you're now starting to put all of that information into a structure. So you have a framework. Within that framework, only you must operate. And once you clarify that framework, you basically define its key components, draw it and show it to your client. Let them also join you in your problem solving journey. It is a process. All of you need to solve this together. You and the client are not enemies. You are friends. They are paying you for your services. They want you around for continued services. If they trust your problem methodology, your systematic approach, your way of solving this, they will come back to you repeatedly. I have had so many clients who, even today, I have left the industry, I have left the sector, I still get calls only because I have never failed to involve them in problem solving. Every time, whether it is interview or practical situation, I have always made sure to involve them, make sure to educate them what I think is the way to go forward, and draw and show. Without showing, you can't do anything. The third stage is basically the analytical stage. So once you go into the structuring, can you move forward? Yeah. So once you go into the analysis, first of all, what is analysis? You have created a structure. Now you want to deep dive into the structure. As I mentioned, profit is revenue minus cost. Very simple. Revenue is unit revenue to number of units. Cost is fixed cost plus operating cost. Operating cost is cost per unit into number of units. Now, wherever there's an issue, you must analyze, right? What is analysis? The meaning of analysis is to take down this big giant problem where he says, I'm having a revenue drop, I'm having a volume drop. It's a very big problem, right? Actually, you have to break it down into specific. Why did you have a volume drop? Was it a specific product range that had that volume drop? Did that volume drop happen in some geographies or did it happen in other geographies? Was there some external event that was going on? So breaking that big problem into smaller component parts, that is what is called analysis, right? So fundamentally, any problem in the world can be solved if you break it into smaller problems. Step by step, you solve all those problems, everything will get resolved. That is fundamental for any consultant. Second, always know where to start from. You can start from anywhere. As I mentioned, in a case study, in a consulting practical situation, the interviewee is the person who is setting the entire tone of the problem. It is not the interviewer. The interviewer is actually a listener. They are the people who are getting some insight from how you solve the problem. But it is the interviewee who sets the tone of the problem. But to align where these two people are having that conversation, the starting point must be clear. If you're solving a revenue problem, you solve a revenue problem. If you're solving a cost problem, you solve a cost problem. If you're solving a business expansion problem, you're solving a. Don't switch problems. The starting point defines the area and the range within which you solve a problem. That is the key point, right? Make sure you get that clarified in any situation, whether it is interviews or practical. Very important, right? Third is what researchers will be very, very aligned with is state a hypothesis. In science, the scientific method is about stating a hypothesis and testing it. You state a hypothesis and you test it. If the hypothesis is correct, it's a true hypothesis. If it is rejected or a null hypothesis, you throw it away, right? But in a business case study problem, you say that why don't we, so the way how you state a hypothesis, let's say it's a revenue problem. You come and say, okay, I think that the revenue drop might be because of some changes to your workforce. So why don't we investigate that further? If the interviewer says, no, I don't think it is the workforce, I think it has more to do with the geography, then you will be like, okay, let me state a new hypothesis. I am assuming that this geography that you're talking about is a new geography that you've entered recently, or there has been some kind of geographical change that has happened. What you do is, whenever you get an area to go into, you start with a hypothesis, investigate that hypothesis, investigate it, and keep refining that hypothesis. At the end, you say, okay, this hypothesis seems to be largely right. If this hypothesis is right, these are the ways to solve it. Right? So state a hypothesis so that everybody is clear what is happening. Don't just leave it in the air. Clearly state the hypothesis. Hypothesis stating is very important for process orientation of case study solutions. Right? Now the fourth piece, which is when you deep dive into problems, always not just stick to the framework that I mentioned, the branch of the framework. When you go into revenue, for example, if you're talking about revenue per product, stick to only revenue per product. Finish that branch, exhaust the investigation of that branch before you go into number of products sold. So revenue per product into number of products is total revenue. If you're talking about investigating issues at revenue per product, you must not change gears and suddenly move into the total number of products. You must investigate that separately, this separately. That is what gives the framework solutioning, right? And process oriented solution. Never forget that. Right? They want your methodology and your structure. They do not want any theoretical structure. They don't care, right, what it is. They want your structure, right? How you do this. Hey, is there a network issue at my end? Can you hear me okay?
We
Yes,
can
sir,
hear
you're
you,
audible.
sir.
Right. After that, once you basically isolate the branch that you're investigating, key issues within that branch, 5 whys, all these are good frameworks, right? Fishbone diagrams. All these are good frameworks that you learn in basically management theory, which is definitely to be incorporated in a practical sense. You must learn from management thinkers, but use it and speak today's business language to today's clients, right? So investigate those key issues in each branch. Ask the whys, 5 whys you can ask, fishbone diagram you can ask. You can use your intuitive problem solving approach, but do it within the bounds of that branch. Right? Then always make sure that you have finished asking standard questions. A lot of times consultants think, I know it all. I've done this so many times that, okay, let me just ask the interesting questions or the deeper questions or whatever it is. Never do that, right? No matter how tempting it is, no matter how sure you think you are that you know all the answers, make sure that you cover your standard questions in a practical situation. People, like I said, there is no place for mavericks in business. What people want is structured thinking, because mavericks means risk. Structured, methodical, dependable, right? That is what is consulting. If you want to be a maverick, if you want to be a hero who is basically telling something, and all music is coming when you're coming in, people are hitting beats when you enter some building, and everybody's cheering while you're talking. If your expectation of life and business is like that, I strongly recommend don't go into management consulting. That is not the world for you. There are hundreds of other places where mavericks are loved. For example, sales loves mavericks. Similarly, entrepreneurship is a place for mavericks. Non-profits might be good places for mavericks, but rebels, mavericks, people who have this hero complex, who want to be like they want to be like this film hero type, these crazy people, those people are not going to do well in consulting. Right? I'm going to just make this very clear. Consulting is for risk averseness. It is for people who don't want to take risks, but it is for people who want to be structured, methodical, and who hate to make mistakes. That is what consulting is for. So standard questions, very important. That is dependable. You need to ask those, right? And at any point in time when you're solving these case studies in an interview setting, never make the assumption of whether you should tell only this much. Like you're feeling tired, you just want to do a basic level analysis and basically just say something and go. But that is not what you have to do. You have to always clarify with the customer. So they say, go deeper into that area, investigate further, go deeper if you have to. Similarly, if there is another branch of the problem that they want you to do, so they will ask you to shift branches. So you must be willing to shift, but all of it must be in alignment with the client. So never forget, client is first. Client is the only reason you're there. Client or interviewer. Client and interviewer is the person who is God, and they will set the tone for you. You must solve as per their level that they want you to investigate. Finally, as I said about hypothesis testing, state your hypothesis, refine it. The objective is to keep on refining the hypothesis that you have as you go along, proceeding in the case solution. Next slide, please. These two things I just wanted to just mention, just so that, because these are useful in practical situations. Always make some critical comparisons. Whenever you can make a comparison, you must try to make some kinds of comparisons generally in a interview setting or in a practical setting. Some of the easy comparisons you can do is this firm versus competitors. As I mentioned, every firm only knows itself. Very few people know what's happening outside. Even if they know, they will not pay very deep attention. So that is your opportunity to demonstrate industry knowledge. So I would say firms versus competitors, very good framework for analysis. Similarly, for data, to trend identification, like for example, they said profit has dropped. You'll ask, what was profit last year? What was profit this year? Oh, the trend has fallen like this. What was profit last month, this month? At this time last year, what was the trend like? That way, you will get a lot more insight into what happened over the last year, what happened the last couple of years. That's really helpful when you go to solve what has changed. So putting this time framework in your problem is very, very useful in terms of how you solve this. Now, finally, segment, right? Never forget this. I just keep reiterating this again and again because it is so important that you need to understand that for consulting, segmentation is absolutely critical. There are many ways to segment a problem, but without segmenting, that's not a good idea to solve the problem. Now let's talk about how do we close a case. So conclusion is, if you don't conclude well, everything you've done in between is waste. If you don't design your conclusions, if you don't bring that into a practical framework that people understand, there's no use, right? So you need to, after you have spoken to the interviewer, so typically case interview rounds and all happen for 1 hour, 1.5 hours and stuff like that. They're very long, very stressful. People will go deeply into it, check every part. You are covering a lot of areas. So for big complex cases, when you take some cases from from MBBs, from McKinsey, Bain, BCG, when you can Google and find some. But you will realize that to solve those cases will take hours. And what happens is you're covering so much that at the end of all of that, when you need to leave, you can't start again the entire Ramayana from Rama came out and whatever he was born and people were angry with him and they asked, you can't start there. You need to figure out the crux of it is, yeah, he left for the sake of whatever. He came back for the sake of whatever. He was successful doing whatever. 3 points, the big key ideas, that's it. We don't want to get into details. We just want to present 3 or 4 key takeaways, big picture. And basically, these are the critical elements that he did in terms of that story. All the other Ramkatha, you leave it to Ramkatha. Forget about it. That is later. Similarly, big picture conclusion. Big picture conclusion, very, very important. It cannot talk about some detail. Yeah, I found a 5% gain in this thing in inventory that no one wants to hear. The big picture is your inventory will improve. You can do it by 5% or 10% of it. Like that, if you state, that's a very clear way, right? A very clear takeaway for these days. Then, as I mentioned, golden rule of consulting. If you're talking without data, you're not a consultant. With data makes you a consultant. Without data makes you a common man. So consulting means data. You're talking, every statement has to have data somewhere near it. Very, very important, very, very critical. Now, I'll give you some example of bad closes. Like basically what the guy says, India's population is 7 billion. There is a average income of India is this much, this much, this much. Everybody is basically having these issues. COVID cases are rising by XYZ. They'll tell you all of these different data elements continuously for 1 minute. And then finally they say, so the conclusion is that we must continue living in India. It will be a very poor conclusion that makes no relevance to all of the 500 pieces of data you presented. Basically, you are nothing better than a human calculator. If you're just talking continuously, like a fool, if you're just saying some numbers continuously and you're not concluding well, there's no use. The second is a decent close, is you directly get to the value proposition. You say, I believe that you can I believe that you can improve sales by basically leveraging your 30% improved sales force with 20% more discounts and 15% more time investment or whatever it is. Right? So conclusion, data. Finally, the best close. Right? The best close is actionable recommendations. Every conclusion, action. You can take this action. Basically, your sales will increase. You make this. You hire these guys, or you fire those guys, or you sell off that division, or you merge that division, or you buy a company. That is very clear, right? Actionable recommendation. Then clearly relevant, absolutely logically related data points. The rule of three, right? They call it the rule of three. McKinsey is very famous. Rule of three means never speak in anything except 3 to 4 things. Any beyond that is basically a waste of time. No one will remember, and no one will have it in their mind also. So this is the final slide, and after that we can hopefully, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take those. So this is basically the part where you practice the opening and closing. Read Wall Street, Economist. These are the best of the best of the best in the world. If you can find those, I recommend strongly. The Economist is my favorite, absolute favorite journal. It costs me a lot, but it is absolutely worth it. Right? Reading The Economist makes me wiser every day. I cannot recommend The Economist enough. I strongly urge you to recommend it to others as well. Or if you have the ability, take a subscription. Get your people to read The Economist. Get your folks to read the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is also not as good as The Economist, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. Indian newspapers, I would recommend reading maybe some of the magazines as opposed to the newspapers, because or editorials. Editorials are a great place to read and basically improve your understanding. So even in business newspapers and stuff, look at editorials. Similarly, for case studies itself, practice with partners, practice with people, practice with your profs, practice with your research colleagues, practice with your teams. Really useful, really helpful. And once you do it for long enough, I'm sure you'll get a much better sense of what is a waste of time, what is this bundle we're talking, and what is practical, useful. I'm interested, I want to continue. So if it's interesting, that's a good way to solve. If it's boring, that's a bad way to solve. So boredom is an enemy of good case study solving. And that is the first thing that you must recognize when you're not doing it well, is it's boring. So if it is boring, it is not an interesting case study. Similarly, practice drawing. Like basically get used to drawing frameworks, drawing something, sketching it out, structuring stuff, putting it together. There's a framework called MISI, which is mutually exclusive, comprehensively exhaustive. Look at all of this stuff. It's really useful. Do it on graph papers, do it on whiteboards. Flip charts are again great options. And for practical case interviews, one thing you must get used to is practicing maths of large numbers. So people can do, I think generally you can do till people do around till 20 to 20 tables or what. But you must start getting used to multiplying large numbers. Like for example, here I have 5,000 into 15,000. You must be able to do it in your head. And if you take too much time to do it, it's not very confidence boosting for the client, like because they're waiting for you to do it on a calculator and type something in hand. So work on some large numbers, like 1 billion into 800 or $1, $2, whatever it is. Like just pick some big numbers, some easy numbers. 2 million. Don't get scared of these millions, crores, 1,000 crores and stuff like that. And it makes things a lot easier once you're in that framework basically to solve. So that's my presentation for today. Thank you so much again for your time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Thank you, sir. Now this is a question answer session. Dear participants, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. Meanwhile, I would like to ask questions which were already posted in the chat box. The first one is from SGK. So can you mention some methods of analyzing small cases in an online classes?
Yes, madam. As I mentioned, guesstimation problems are really small cases that get done. Similarly, I do have actually a lot of resources for cases from some of the bigger business schools, which I used in my time back in day. So if, and I'm happy to share a link. I think it's actually customized for every person. So if you can ping me on LinkedIn and find me on LinkedIn, I can actually share individual links for people. So you can find me on LinkedIn and basically I can also share some of these cases from some of these top universities, and it might potentially be useful in terms of finding cases that you can present in class.
Dear participants, I'll be sharing sir's LinkedIn link in the WhatsApp group. So one more question, is there any model or a standard framework with steps for solving small cases in a classroom? Steps
Uh,
for solving
I
small
didn't catch
cases.
it. Can you please repeat?
Steps for solving small cases in classroom, framework or step.
Correct. I think actually that's what I did in this deck. So the reason, as I mentioned, I had to apologize because I didn't get time to design this better. It would have been a lot easier for me to actually show you these frameworks, because what I've written here is actually just the actual framework itself. But to show you how this would look when you solve it in a practical situation, if I had time, I could actually just structure it. It's just a design thing. So the information is already there in this deck. So this is the framework that you would typically use for solving these problems. So, for example, uh, and the second thing is, let me also just tell you this, right? Basics is very important, right? Basics is stuff like profit is equal to revenue minus cost. Revenue is equal to revenue per unit into number of units. Cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. Examples of fixed cost, examples of variable cost. So all of these frameworks come from your the academic stuff that you learn actually. So for example, in accounting, a lot of this stuff comes, right? Like you will know what are the fixed cost, variable cost. So you will have a balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement. Each of these statements feed into each other. So if you look at if you actually understand accounting well enough, you can look at these three sheets and you can tell the entire birth chart of that firm, right? Every single aspect of that can be just identified by just looking at these three sheets. You can tie all of that into these frameworks basically, but just the idea of a framework is your structure to the problem is a framework. Using, for example, Porter's five forces. Five forces is a framework. Similarly, if you have fishbone diagrams, that is a framework for problem solving, right? Or the five whys approach. That is a framework for how do you potentially solve a problem. You have to ask five whys. So these are all examples of frameworks. What I did in this session is to give you case study frameworks. How do you solve these in a live case study environment? And again, I have to apologize for the poor design of this people. I didn't have time at all. But if we do this some other day in the future, I assure you it will be a better presentation and I'll be able to actually do a live demonstration. The best way to actually do this is if you actually see a couple of people do cases in a live situation, and if you have someone give the live feedback for those cases, that really is really useful for external viewers. In fact, classes like negotiation and case studies, they are best done publicly, because when we do this publicly, others actually learn more watching this live as opposed to experiencing this by themselves.
Just one more question. Could you please suggest some websites where we can find real-time case studies which can be used in our teaching?
So as I mentioned, I do have a few resources that were shared to me at Oxford, but unfortunately, I cannot just share it en masse. So I would need to actually send um, individual links for people who can ping me, and I'll need to speak to someone to get that done. So if you can ping me on LinkedIn and give me a couple of days, I'll be able to share what I have. But if you don't want to wait so long and you want to make some things of your own, why don't you just Google McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and just search for their case studies, case interview. So case interviews, they do have some mock case interviews. I do remember using some of those back in the day. So BCG does have it, Bain does have it, McKinsey has it. In fact, I think BCG has a live case study solving exercise, which gives you a flavor. So everybody should remember that each of these consulting firms have their own flavor when it comes to solving cases. Some of them focus on a certain way, some of them do it in another way. So they have their own flavor when it comes to basically hypothesis setting frameworks and stuff like that. But cases themselves are still structured very similarly. So you'll actually get these problems there. And if you want stuff from, let's say, Kellogg, Harvard, Stanford, and stuff like that, and even Oxford, I have a bunch of these. I have a bunch of this stuff lying around. So ping me, and I'll find out how to somehow share a link. And I'm hoping that you can use some of it to basically help your students as well.
Dear delegates, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly to the sir. Okay, I'll take that the end of the question and answer session. The session was most valuable addition to our knowledge.
Hello,
We
madam.
are, yes,
There is one question.
okay, I'm sorry.
How to calculate the operating cost generic to any business?
Sorry, can you repeat that? You calculating the
How to
operating cost.
calculate the operating cost generic to any business?
Got it. So first of all, as you're aware, in the only thing that would be generic in accounting is probably just the balance sheet. That's just my opinion, because in fact, even for these accounting rules, there is a lot of debate. So, for example, you have something called GAR, Generally Accepted Accounting Regulations, or that's a financial standard. You have the FACP, which is the Bureau of Financial Accounting Standards in the United States. You have a bunch of these different people. They are also not able to agree on a common way to basically classify costs and profits and revenues and stuff like this. So there's a lot of debate as to how we go about doing this. But at a broad level, if we say, how do we look at a company's operating cost, right? So operating cost is essentially everything except fixed costs. Fixed costs are infrastructure costs, right? Like, so basically plant equipment and all of that other stuff. So that's basically fixed costs. But if you take operating costs, you'll have salaries as an operating cost, for example. Similarly, you will have transportation, fuel, food allowances. Those are operating costs. You will have rent, which is an operating cost. You will have the raw material costs, which are in batches. So if you're buying it in batches, that's again an operating cost in terms of some of the inputs that go in, right? So for example, electricity is an operating cost. If you're a plant, coal is an operating cost. How are you going to get that? So all of these tends to become operating costs. And again, there is no universally accepted definition. So let me tell you that even for example, manufacturing in manufacturing utilities, coal might not be considered an operating cost. They would consider it an inventory cost as opposed to an operating cost. But the same thing is true that in another situation, the same coal would be considered an operating cost because coal would feed into the captive thermal power plant. Captive thermal power plant generates electricity. Electricity is a direct operating cost. So they consider coal as an operating cost as well. So as I mentioned, there's no specific framework that's available. But I'm hoping that I was able to cover some of the broader operating expenses that you might have. Advertising, again, is a operating cost, marketing. So all of that, for example.
That's the end of question and answer session. The session was most valuable addition to our knowledge. Sir. We all are really glad that we have attended this session. Thank you for teaching us with the real-time examples, how to apply case study approach in practical business situation. We have learned importance of data-driven justification, being right, bring right in a client-friendly way. We have also learned about types of case study problems. Those are guesstimating problems, unit economic problems, acquisition-related problems, business situation problem, capacity expansion problem. The key takeaways, what we have learned is truth, data, segmentation, and big picture conclusion. Grand opening with a great ending. Thank you for teaching us this today. Now I request Madhushri, Assistant Professor of Management and Coordinator of this program, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Pallavi. Good afternoon, one and all. Gratitude helps you to grow and expand. Gratitude brings joy and laughter into your life and into the lives of all those around you. With this beautiful gratification quote by Eileen Caddy, I would take a privilege and honor of conveying word of thanks to all the delegates of today's session. Let me start by giving glory to the Almighty God for making this today's session a resounding success. First and foremost, I express my sincere thanks to our beloved leader, Dr. B. Chandrasekhara, Chief Patron of this program and Principal of Government First Grade College, Vijayanagar, Bengaluru, for motivating us to organize this program.
Thank you, Madhushri.
I, on behalf of GFGC Vijayanagar and organizing committee, I express my sincere thanks to our chief guest and today's resource person, Arvind Jaikumar, delivery manager and principal solutions, Affine Analytics Private Limited. I wholeheartedly thank you, sir. In spite of your weekend day, I mean, though it's a holiday for you, we disturb you in your weekdays, weekends, and you made me to work on this, Saturday. I understand, how weekend is very important for people working in corporate. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your vast knowledge and experience on case study based teaching.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Pleasure is mine, actually. I consider a privilege again to talk to experts like you. And I hope that this will be helpful, whatever little I was able to see.
Yes, sir. We'll try to arrange one more session on to deep dive into case study based learning.
Yes, sure, ma'am. Sure, we will catch up. Thank you so much.
I also thank our dynamic person, Dr. Shubha, patron of this program and IQAC coordinator of GFGC Vijayanagar. I would also thank Professor Manjula, convener of this program, also HOD of Management Department, who guided and assisted us to organize this program.
Thank you, Mother.
I also express my sincere thanks to Professor Kishore Kumar, organizing secretary of this program, for his enormous effort to organize this program. I wholeheartedly thank Professor Pallavi, coordinator of this program, also moderator of this today's session, for excellently moderating this session. I express my special thanks to our delegate participants who have actively participated in the session and made this session a grand success. You are the special part of this program. Thank you very much. At last, I extend my sincere thanks to all the teaching and non-teaching staffs of GFGC Vijayanagar, Bengaluru, for all your support and cooperation. Thank you one and all.
I thank Madhushree for beautifully delivering vote of thanks and being a
Thank
part
you.
of our organizing committee. I wholeheartedly thank Arvind Jaikumar Ayasar for extending his hands in future also for, we shall have a session for our students to how to solve case studies with real-time case studies. Thank you very much, all of you participants, delegates, and all the organizing committee members for making this event successful. I request all the delegates to log in once again at 2 p.m. for the second session of the day. Madam Bina Madam is joining us today from United Kingdom. So please make it a grand success. We will share the link once again in the WhatsApp group. Please watch your WhatsApp group. Kindly fill the feedback links. Thank you one and all. Kishore sir, shall we run?
Yes, madam. Thank you, Arvind sir, once again.
I think this is.
Yes. So we'll wind up and re-log in at 1:45.
Yes.
Okay. See you all.